Brother Guy Gardner was planning on teaching this class, but he got drafted today to be a school bus driver on a school trip and called me a little after noon and asked if I'd fill in for him tonight. We had several people that were listed as sick or families experiencing deaths or people looking out for surgery, and we prayed for them during the main session. Are there any that we did not pray for that we need to be praying for before we start class?
Jim, y'all just make sure I know this prayer for him tonight. Harold, he's in pretty bad shape. He's got a tumor on his brain now and it's pushing it over and he's lost and they have to hang him to the bed and everything.
On his brother, we just need to continue to remember him, Harold Horn. The class material that you have before you tonight, Janita had a roommate named Margie when she was at Freed Hardeman, and she married Manly Luscombe. Manly Luscombe is a Church of Christ preacher. He preaches right now for the Cades congregation in Milan, Tennessee. Most teachers and most preachers put a lot of effort into their classes. Sometimes we don't keep good records, good notes of what we've done. But Manly Luscombe is not one of those kind of people. He keeps meticulous records of the classes that he has taught, of the sermons that he's preached, and he puts them on the internet and he makes them readily available to anybody that would like to use them for research. He has over the years taught a class. He calls it his Searchers class, and he gets the topics for that class by questions that are asked by the students. And they'll ask a question and he'll research that question and then put together a class to answer that question. And when Guy called me this afternoon, I went to his archives of his Searchers class looking for classes that I thought might be interesting for us tonight. And what you have before you is a class that he put together to answer the question, why are some Christians miserable? Well, I know that the Bible talks quite a bit about emotions. Even in the Old Testament, in Habakkuk 3 and verse 18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord, I will joy in the God of my salvation. When you look in the New Testament, when Jesus was coaching his disciples, he said in Luke the 6th chapter, verses 22 and 23, "Blessed are you when men hate you, and when they exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy. For indeed your reward is great in heaven, for in like manner their fathers did to the prophets." And probably one of the more familiar ones is found in the first chapter of James, verses 2 and 3, where James wrote, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience." Or Jesus in John the 15th chapter, verses 10 and 11. "If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in His love. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may remain in you, and that your joy may be full." Or what Peter wrote in 1 Peter 1, verses 6 through 9. "In this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you have been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ, whom having not seen you love, though now you do not see him, yet believing you rejoice with joy inexpressible and full of glory, receiving the end of your faith, the salvation of your souls. I was just wondering, this somebody had the idea that some Christians are miserable. They're not expressing those feelings of joy that we were reading about there. If you were going to put together a list of indicators that, that Christian is just really not happy. That Christian is not bubbling over with enthusiasm about serving the Lord. Tell me something that you might see that would give you that indication. Can you think of anything that would be sort of a signal that a Christian is not happy?
They won't take part in the Lord's work.
They won't take part in the Lord's work, okay? What else?
Expression on their face.
The expression on their face. Now, there is an animal term that we use about the face of some Christians. What kind of animal term is that? Mew face. That's just an old mew-faced Christian. Negative case, indicative mood. All right, what else might you see that would tell you that Christian is not joyful, not rejoicing?
They're unfriendly.
They're unfriendly, okay. Church attendance. All right.
Complaining about everything.
Complaining about everything. We could go on and on. I mean, you mentioned church attendance. We have some people that are here for Sunday school and on time. They're here for worship service. They're fellowshipping with people when they're here. They're wanting to find out about other people. They're interested in what's going on in our lives. They're interested in how they can help. They're here on Sunday night. They're here on Wednesday night. We need volunteers for a work day or vacation Bible school, and they're right there and got their name down. That's just sort of an indication that Christianity is a major part of their lives. And then we've got all those things that you mentioned that might make this a valid question. Why are some Christians miserable? Well, Brother Luscombe gave about 7 reasons, and as time permits, we're going to look at some of these. He started out with Jonah, and you'll remember that Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital city of the enemy of Israel, and so it would be like us wanting to see our enemy destroyed. That's how Jonah was. Jonah wanted to see the enemy of the Israelites destroyed, and he resisted God's appeal that he go in there and preach to that city. But finally, you know all the story. And when he went in and he preached to the city, and they put on sackcloth and ashes and repented, and God changed his mind about destroying that city, Jonah pouted. He was not happy. And there in Jonah 4 and verse 4, the Lord said to him, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Now, I think there's something buried in that statement that God made to Jonah. And one of those things that's buried in there is God notices our opinions, and not only our opinions, but our emotions. And some emotions are okay with God, and some emotions are inappropriate with God. Abraham Lincoln said, most folks are about as happy as they make up their minds to be. We had a preacher's luncheon this week, and David Conley, who preaches over at Dennis, over at the Liberty congregation, was telling the story of a person that ran a barber shop, and they had a visitor come in there, and the visitor said, I'm getting ready to move into your town, and I was just wondering what kind of people am I going to find here? And the barber said, well, tell me about the people in the town where you're coming from. Well, he said, they're sort of critical, can't ever do anything right, not very nice to you, not very what you'd call neighborly, and he just went on, and the barber said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, but that's about the same kind of people we got here. It wasn't very much later till another fella came in, and he was asking him the same question, said, I'm getting ready to move into your town. And he said, well, what kind of people were in your town? Oh, it was a great town. We're always trying to make the town better, make it prettier. We help one another. If anything happens to one family, the whole town rallies around the family. And he said, well, you're going to find about the same town here. And you know, he was probably right in the way he answered both of those people, because we can generate a reaction to ourselves by how we behave around people. Maybe that's why Jesus had what we call the golden rule. Some people are only happy if they're miserable. You may have known people like that. Some people need to have something to worry about. If they don't have something to worry about, well, they're just not happy. And my mama used to, I think it was my mother, might have been my daddy, but one of the other of them used to talk about people being born in the negative case and the kickative mood. It was just seemed to be in their genes. And so maybe one of the reasons that some people are miserable about being Christians is that they just want to be miserable. But I find it interesting, a statement that Jesus made in Matthew, the 23rd chapter, verse 24, where he called the Pharisees blind guides who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. If you look at the context of what he had to say there, in the 23rd verse, he said, woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the other undone. In other words, what they did was they put their focus on the trivial, maybe urgent, but not important, rather than focusing on the things that would truly be important and make a difference in life. We might classify them as nitpicking or harsh or critical. I want us to just spend a little bit of time seeing if we can identify what we would call gnats that we'd strain at, and camels, things that we'd swallow without even thinking about it. And he put together a list of those on your sheet. And his example of a gnat was some people get all bent out of shape if somebody happens to say Jesus was visited by 3 wise men. And they can probably argue for 3 hours on, it doesn't say how many wise men. He would call that a gnat. And yet, on the other side, they may be involved in or let gossip go on and on and on, and they turn a blind eye to that, where they really ought to be dealing with things that are important, things that are probably going to make a difference between a person going to heaven and going to hell. Steve Hodgin, I didn't see you here. Good to have you. Welcome to Boonville. Now, why don't you help me some more? Give me some ideas of things that would be gnats. Things that we might put a lot of emphasis on. And then we're going to look at things that we should be putting emphasis on, but maybe we neglect. Can you think of any other gnats?
Well, I can give you an example. It's hard actually to talk about. The saddest thing, and all I can do is pray about it, as a preacher, it's been a couple of years now, a lady began to worship with us and came from a very confused religious background, came through us through house to house probably, and just kind of showed up one day and had a lot of interesting religious ideas, let's put it that way. And basically I ended up in a Bible study with her in the parking lot that turned into several opportunities when she obeyed the gospel. She became a Christian, and it was fantastic. But she had a long way to go, and she had struggles when she attended, and then she'd get sick, and then she attended. But one day, in a casual conversation, she made a statement that she hadn't been feeling well, and she had this habit of listening to contemporary Christian music. Had done that all her life. And one of our sweet ladies told her that it was a sin for her to do that, and she'd go to hell if she didn't stop immediately. And I've not seen her since. I've spoken to her on the phone, but we just don't understand. Not everybody grew up in the church, and it takes miles to get people from point A to point B. And when that happens, you don't know what to do. Well, you can't do anything. Cry a little while, then pray about it, and all you can do is keep going. But, sometimes there are things we make so important that really, why don't we let God deal with it?
Right. When you think about all of Paul's instructions about not being a stumbling block to other people, and a lot of times these little gnats that we think are so important can trip up a new Christian. And we need to be very sensitive on how we deal with new Christians. And that's so important for this congregation. When you think about the number of baptisms that Greg shares every day on Celebration Sunday, and where the background is of most of the people that were baptized on that list, we need to recognize that they're newborn babes and need to grow. I'm not looking for the right word. There needs to be a gradual path of growth for them, and we need to change the food that we're feeding them as they go along that particular path. All right, can you think of another gnat? Eve only ate an apple, or Eve ate that apple. Hey, it doesn't say what it was. And you can get into that conversation. Or who was the author of Hebrews? And you can argue all day over the author of Hebrews. Jesus was not born on December 25th, and you can argue all day over when he was born. And when you get to the end of it, what have you accomplished? And yet you might neglect studying about forgiveness, studying about prayer. You might neglect talking about the importance of Sunday night and Wednesday night attendance, or elder qualifications, or church discipline, or sacrificial giving. Now, I just find it interesting that Jesus himself was concerned about straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. Tells me Jesus had a little bit of sense of humor as well. And then the third thing he said that might make people miserable is they're excuse makers instead of responsibility takers. And in Genesis, the 3rd chapter, Brother Farr has just been talking about the excuses that were made there in the 3rd chapter. Then the Lord called to Adam and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." And he said, Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you that you should not eat? Then the man said, "The woman that you gave me to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I ate." And the Lord said unto the woman, "What is this that you have done?" And the woman said, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." One excuse right after another. And maybe when we get into this habit of making excuses rather than taking responsibility, ultimately we become unhappy with ourselves. That's a possibility. Over in Luke, the 14th chapter, Jesus talked about the man that gave the great supper, and he invited many, and then one excuse right after another about not coming to the supper. Was Jesus happy with that? I don't know if the people were happy, but But the master was certainly not happy with that. The master said to the servant, "Go out into the highways and hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste of my supper." Now, when we think about excuses, we'd love to have that 100 or so people that are choosing not to be at Sunday school to really come and be actively involved in the Bible study. But when you ask them, what kind of excuses have you heard when you tried to encourage people to be at Bible study? Does anybody here ever make an excuse for not coming to Bible study? Had company.
Someone said the Bible don't say you have to come.
Oh, the Bible doesn't say you have to come every time. Okay. What other excuses have you heard?
Just too tired.
Too tired. Did
My only
you
day
know
to
that
rest.
the time changed and I lost an hour of sleep already?
Rest.
It's my only day to rest. Okay. Well, let me make it a little more. We have a thing that is carried on since Stephen Guy was here. When Stephen Guy was here, there was a study about prayer, and coming out of that study about prayer, there was a 5:30 prayer session that started with the Boonville congregation, and it has continued on since the time of Stephen Guy. I make out a suggested prayer list sheet every week, and I run 22 copies. Every week. And I haven't run out of sheets since I've been in Boonville. What kind of excuses do you think people might make for not coming to the 5:30 prayer session? I'm sorry.
Too early to get there.
What kind of excuses do you think Brother Gross hears when he's asking people to volunteer for being a class teacher? Now, I know he needs class teachers, but I know there's one lady that's teaching on Sunday morning and on Wednesday night, and that's not our design. And the only reason she's doing that is because there haven't been enough volunteers there. Maybe more than one. Why do you think we don't have more people volunteering to be Bible class teachers? Now, you remember that Brother Billy said one of the indicators of people that are really happy and involved with the Lord is that they're involved with the work of the congregation. So I know there's opportunities there. Maybe we'll think about it, okay? His fourth item, emphasis on material things. There are some people in this class that have lived long enough that they can talk about how things were 50 years ago. And if you wanted to think about the cost of living, or not the cost of living, just examples of lifestyle and what we accepted as typical lifestyles, and how is that different now from 50 years ago? Let's start with the kind of houses that we live in. Is there anything different in the kind of typical house today versus the typical house 50 years ago?
Air conditioning.
Air conditioning is norm. What else is different? Water, running water in the house. Electricity in the house. Bathrooms in the house. More than one.
About $250,000 more in college.
Oh, the cost is up about $250,000 more in some of those houses. What about cars? Didn't even have one. Okay, what about cars for kids? Unheard of. When we were in Georgia last weekend, we were driving with our grandchildren out to a baseball game, and Lexi said, "Well, this is where my parking place is." And Janita was talking about when she was a senior in high school, or when she went to high school here in Booneville. She said in her senior class, she thought maybe there might have been 3 people that had cars, but nobody else had cars. Maybe you got to borrow the family car sometime, but you didn't have a car of your own. And yet now it's sort of an expected thing. When the child gets old enough to drive, they're going to get a clunker, and when they get maybe a senior in high school, they might even get a new car. Or it might be a better car when they first get one. It's wrong to ride the bus today. Now, what I'm doing is I'm showing that over the last 50 years, what we've accepted as commonplace has changed. Our standard of living, our mindset about standard of living is different. When you think about what Solomon said in Ecclesiastes 2 and verse 11, he said, "Then I looked at all the works of my hands had done, and on the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun." Or if you go to Matthew 6, 19 through 21, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And if we have people that are putting their time into their work, God expects us to be good at the jobs that we have. To work on the jobs that we have as if we were working for Christ. I mean, to be a bad worker is to bring a reflection on the church and a reflection on Christ. But when the work becomes our life, and what we can get with what we earn is the most important thing in our lives, then we're putting our treasure in the wrong place. And ultimately, we're going to be miserable. We may not think we're miserable now, but there will be a time when we will be miserable. In 1 John 2, 15 through 17, I'm thinking about gadgets and trinkets here. "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world, and the world is passing away, and the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever." When you go to a restaurant, have you noticed lately that a lot of times people are not talking to one another? There seems to be this little rectangular thing that is sitting in a lot of people's hands. Now, there's some finger punching that's going on, and there may be some texting that's going to one person on the other side of the table to this side. I can't tell, but we have just seemed to be obsessed with iPads and iPhones and other brands of that kind of thing. Maybe we're getting caught up with electronics and gadgets. And you may have known people who've gotten caught up in video games and will stay up all night on video games and get on networks and be playing games with other people all around the world. Things that are not in and of themselves wrong can be made wrong if they become our priority in life. And people who have those kinds of priorities are going to be miserable in the Lord's church, because Christ needs to be the priority. For the sake of time, let's jump to number 6. And that one is, he suggests that some people are miserable because they depend too much on other people. And I've got Romans 3:32. If you find Romans 3:32, it's got more verses in it than my Bible does. That's supposed to be 3:23. All have sinned. and fall short of the glory of God. We need to remember that, because if we're going to put our trust in an individual, we're going to put our trust in something that is cracked and broken and inferior to Jesus Christ. In Proverbs 3 and verse 5, we're told, trust in the Lord, not in your own understanding. In 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, Paul had to chastise them about the cliques that were forming in the congregation. And I think this depends on other brethren. The point that Brother Luscombe was trying to make here was that we're supposed to be a family unto itself, the Lord's family. And we ought to be supporting one another and helping one another grow. If we're the little toe and we get stumped up against the coffee table in the middle of the night, the rest of the family ought to be coming to our rescue and rubbing the toe or whatever it needs to be done. You know, in 1 Corinthians 3, 4 through 7, he wrote, "For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal? Who then is Paul, and who is Apollos, but ministers through whom you believed, and as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then, neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase." What is the damage potential if we end up having cliques within a congregation? Division. That's what they were having there at Corinth. They were having division. Is there any other damage potential if we have a lot of cliques forming in a congregation?
There's a danger of people being left out, Brother Jim.
It's the danger that people will be left out. That's what you were saying too. You know, we're supposed to rejoice with those that rejoice and mourn with those that mourn. You know, if you have cliques, it's not unusual for somebody in that clique to get sick and go to the hospital and have members of the clique visit them. But people outside the clique get sick and go to the hospital, and they're lonely there. Nobody thinks about going and visiting them. And that doesn't need to be the way that the Lord's church is. And then that seventh item, lives are not right with God, is going to make people miserable in the church. You know, if a person is walking the fence between Satan and the Lord, they're not going to be happy. If they want one foot on one side of the fence and the other foot on the other side of the fence, they're going to run into a fence post periodically. Now in Proverbs 13 and verse 15, good understanding gains favor, but the way of the unfaithful is hard. In Paul's letter to the Philippians 2:15 and 16, rejoice in the day of Christ, or rejoice in His second coming. He said, do all things without complaining and disputing, that you may become blameless and harmless, children of God without fault in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast the word of life, so that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain or labored in vain. Now, what could cause Paul not to rejoice? Well, if you understand what he's saying there, he said sin in the camp would cause me to lose my joy. Or if I see you as a congregation complaining and disputing, that's going to cause me to lose my joy. The opposite of that, let's keep sin out of the camp, and let's be focused on encouraging one another. Brother Farr, I think, is scheduled to be back next week. Thank you for your help. God bless you.